Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're watching. The channel's called Ratchet, my name's Andrew, and on this episode we spray some paint on the engine. Run the title. Let's make this short and sweet so we can get down to business. This episode we're going to be spraying the engine block and start the reassembly. So I'm hoping there's going to be a huge transformation in this engine. As always, leave a comment below, always really appreciated. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't done already, that's even more appreciated. And finally, follow me on Instagram, Ratchet GT40. That'll do, let's get on with it. I've got the engine masked up, degreased and ready to go. I spray at a fairly low pressure and with a small detail gun. So the actual cloud and dust settlement isn't actually too bad. So this should be sufficient to keep the majority of the garage clear. I'm going to get some etch primer mixed up and into the gun and start laying down my first mist coat. Okay, so full disclosure, that initial coat of etch primer didn't quite go according to plan. As soon as I started putting it on, it highlighted a few areas around the block where I'd removed the old flaking paint and got it down to the iron block. I'd not blended that very well back into the solid substrate paint, you know, the paint that I'm actually keeping. So that left me with some jaggedy looking lines and edges which, although they would never be seen, would annoy me. You know, I want to get this as nice as I can going through the process that I am going through. So what I've done is let the first initial coat of etch prime dry before now going back over it with a wire brush again to blend in the old paint to the actual block itself. Now I'm hoping that when I get some fresh paint on this again, it's now going to give me that nice, fairly seamless blend in between all of the paint finishes.
A few moments later.
Pleased to say that everything worked out really nicely with that paint blend. So I managed to get the rest of the block primed, gave it 2 or 3 coats there or thereabouts. That has now flashed off and is dry. So now I can get on with the black.
Tomorrow.
I've decided that spray painting is exactly like welding. When you've got the settings just set perfectly, everything just flows beautifully. And I'm pleased to say that was the case when I was laying down the paint onto the block. The pressure was lovely, the paint feed was just perfect, the fan width, and it just laid down an absolute treat. So I'm hoping that once I start taking off some of the masking, I'm going to be left with a result that I'm happy with. So I think with that being said, I'll get some of this masking taken off. I'm going to leave it over the rockers until I've got my rocker covers refurbished. But I think everything else can come off and I can start the reassembly process.
3 days later.
I had a phone call telling me that my parts had been powder coated and rocker covers been blasted. And here you can see the raw aluminium rocker covers, beautifully clean and ready for some primer. Once the primer was dry, it was then onto the good old satin black to tie these in with the rest of the engine. So I've got the valve covers sprayed in satin black. They've had a coat of etch primer, a coat of high build primer, then 2 or 3 coats of satin to give me this really nice finish that I've got on them. So the final thing I need to do is take in some wet and dry on a sanding block, go over the top of the fins to expose the raw aluminium just to give me that detail along the top that I want. think for a little homebrew job, these haven't turned out too badly. They need a really good clean because there's still some sanding, dust and bits and pieces in between a couple of the fins. But generally speaking, I think they're ready for mock-up back on the engine. So this is the engine done. This is the stage that I'm taking it to in terms of refurb. Annoyingly, I bought the wrong rocker cover gaskets, so I've just had to temporarily put the old ones back in just to put the covers back on top. So I've got a new set on order, so then I can finally button up getting these rockers on. You'll see that I've taken the carb off the top and fitted the lift plate because this is very soon, fingers crossed, going to be going back into the car. You will have hopefully seen on the montage that the gearbox has also had a clean up and a lick of paint, so that is looking nice and clean as well. So generally, I'm happy with how everything's turned out in relation to the amount of time that I've spent on this and the level of strip down that I went to. All of the paint has laid down really nicely on all of the parts that I have painted, so I'm really pleased about that. Getting the adapter plate between the gearbox painted up has made a huge difference because that was a rusty mess beforehand. There are a few other little bits and pieces that I have refurbed along the way which will be fitted onto the engine after it's back in the hole. I'm still waiting on my replacement distributor cap that's coming in from the US. Then following on from that, again, once the engine's back in the car, I can look at exactly what I'm going to do about HT leads, whether I buy an off-the-shelf product or whether I go down the route of making my own. For some reason, it's about at this point, my sound becomes completely unsynced with my video, but it's basically just to say, in the next video, I'll be, fingers crossed, fitting the engine and gearbox back into the car. So up until then, I will catch you next time.